Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host. Joining us, as he does almost every single week, is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to talk with you.
Hey, Brandon. Always good to see you and talk to you.
Now, we're recording this a few weeks before the episode goes live. You're getting ready to go out of the country to Panama for the big World Youth Day. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, I leave tonight because I got to drive to L.A. and then I get the plane early tomorrow morning, which goes right to Panama City. And yeah, World Youth Day. I wasn't planning on going, honestly. And then I got an invitation not that long ago to speak at the benediction, which I look forward to. It's a big gathering in this arena. I don't know how many thousands of kids, but it's a chance to speak to a lot of people at one time. And yeah, I like World Youth Day. I've been to two. I've been to Madrid and to Krakow. So it'll be my third one. And yeah, I leave tonight from here and then early tomorrow morning. Then it's a quick trip. I'm just there for Wednesday. The talk is late Wednesday evening, and I come back Thursday morning.
Bishop is speaking at a special event that's being co-organized by the USCCB, the Knights of Columbus, and Focus. And our friends at Focus are going to be live streaming the talk. And so the video will be available by the time this goes live. So if you're interested in watching Bishop Barron's talk, you can find it online. Bishop, today we're going to be talking about one of the people we focused on in a couple episodes in the past, namely Dr. Jordan Peterson. He's one of the most fascinating intellectual figures on the scene today. He's the author of the best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life, which spent many, many, many weeks on top of all the bestseller lists. I still think it's pretty high up there last time I checked. But you recently wrote an article about Dr. Jordan Peterson and a conversation partner, Sam Harris. You said that over the holiday break, you sort of binge watched a lot of the stage dialogues that Peterson and Harris shared with each other. Maybe just to get started here, give us a refresher. Who is Dr. Jordan Peterson? What should we know about him? Why is he significant?
Well, you said most of it. I mean, he's a psychology professor from Toronto who emerged in the last couple of years, really, just pretty recently, as a major internet phenomenon. Very smart guy, Jungian psychologist by training, a practicing psychotherapist, but also a theorist about a lot of cultural issues. And he came on the radar screen in Canada over a lot of this gender debates and pronouns and all that stuff. But then he started doing these talks on psychological themes and now on biblical, and I'd call them sort of spiritual themes that have been very, very popular. And, he's a smart guy who's got a knack for, kind of naming things in a provocative way. So he stirred up a lot of both controversy and enthusiasm. I've enjoyed listening to him a lot. And, so that's Jordan Peterson. And then Sam Harris, is one of the four horsemen of the new atheisms, along with Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett. Sam Harris is the fourth of the four horsemen. So these guys emerged after 9/11, early 2000s. Harris wrote a book called Letter to a Christian Nation, which is a sharp polemic against, religion, but Christianity in particular. He's also very sharp, articulate fellow. He continues to be one of the most strident critics of religion. And he and Peterson were paired because Peterson's begun speaking in a more positive way, not, as positively as I would want to speak about religion, but still quite a few steps away from Sam Harris. So they've paired them together to have these debates. So when I was home, as you say, I spent some time watching these. I enjoy that kind of thing. And I looked at a number of these conversations between him and Harris, and just found them fascinating.
I want to talk about some of the ideas that they exchanged, and I want to dig into that a little bit. But first of all, let's just pause and consider the significance of sort of this quasi-religious guy, Peterson, on stage with a very outspoken atheist, Sam Harris, having a civil, substantial dialogue. Like, to me, I'm like, more of that. We need more of that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's great. And less shouting and more conversing. I'll tell you something, too, and I'd never heard this term before, and I learned it from this debate. The moderator said, now we're going to begin tonight by asking each man to steel man the other's argument. And I thought, steel man? What does that mean? Well, then it quickly became apparent. To straw man an argument, right, is to present it in the weakest way so you can just knock it down easily. So the opposite of that is to steel man, meaning as best you can, present your opponent's position strongly. Present it in the most convincing way possible. And I thought that's really a good exercise for anyone involved in this kind of debate. That would benefit people a lot on the internet, in those internet fever swamps, if they could learn to do that. To say, okay, before we go any further, I'm going to steel man your argument. I'm going to try to state as persuasively as possible what you're saying. So anyway, that's a term that I learned from watching their debates.
Now, inevitably, in each of these debates, Sam Harris begins by citing a long litany of wrongs that
Yeah.
religion in general, but Christianity in particular, has committed over the centuries. So things like oppression, violence, slavery, genocide,
Mm-hmm.
inquisitions, witch hunts. But then you write in your recap of these discussions, Peterson turns attention to really two extremes that help explain some of these problems. One of them is fundamentalism, the other is chaotic relativism. Talk
Yeah.
about those two extremes.
Yeah, I thought that was helpful. The move that Harris makes, I mean, every single critic of religion from time immemorial has made a similar move. And to fill the picture out, it's something like this. Religion is irrational. It's dogmatic. It's unself-critical. It relies on superstition and pure faith, which is why it's not surprising that it becomes so corrupt, because elements within it that would provide self-critique are eliminated. And so naturally it tends toward this kind of extreme expression. Well, see, Peterson largely agrees with that. It reminds me there of what's his name, the great Dominican Herbert McCabe. When he would debate atheists, he would almost always begin by saying, I agree with you completely. In other words, because he thought that what they were knocking down was essentially a straw man. Well, anyway, Peterson largely agrees with that. And what he says is it's a Jungian sort of language. There's a shadow that always haunts religion. And it's the shadow of fundamentalism. So everything I just named, unself-critical, unreasonable, fideistic, hypercritical of one's opponents, etc. Those are all marks of a fundamentalistic attitude. Maybe today we'd see it more clearly in forms of Islam, but you can see it in almost every major religion. And Peterson is saying, yeah, I grant you that's a shadow of religion. But, as I read him, don't reduce religion to its shadow. And that's a typical Christopher Hitchens move. They all do that. They'll take the worst side of religious expression and simply say, that's religion. Where I would say with Peterson, no, that's the shadow of religion, that we have to acknowledge. Okay. Now, then Peterson makes the next move, which is to say, yeah, I'll grant you there's this shadow side, but there's another shadow, which is chaotic relativism. If you go lurching away from what you perceive as dogmatism, that you go running in the opposite direction, you can run right into the arms of this chaotic relativism. There is no truth. There is no meaning. Everything's up for grabs. Everything's relativistic. What they said, 100 years ago is no longer true. What we say now won't be true in 100 years. It's all up for grabs. Well, that, says Peterson, and I agree with him, is just as deleterious. It's just as destructive. That's the shadow, if you want, of secularist rationalism. And so might we explore the territory that lies in between fundamentalism and relativism, chaotic relativism. So I thought that was a legitimate move, and that there is plenty of space that we could move into and explore in between those two extremes.
Say a little bit more about the danger of chaotic relativism, because in your commentary on these exchanges, you've said that this relativism is anchorless, impotent, without moral seriousness, but it's proven to be just as dangerous as fundamentalism. How's that so?
And well, for those very reasons. See, if you say, finally, who knows what's morally right? Well, thank you. That's an invitation to every totalitarian dictator up and down the centuries. There is no morality. Therefore, why not? As wasn't it Lenin or was it Stalin? One of the two. You got to crack some eggs to make an omelet. And if that means killing a few million people, well, so be it. There is no moral absolute. That's a pretty dangerous position to move into. The same with epistemological relativism. There's no truth. Nothing's true. Well, then, see, watch out, because powerful people are going to move right into that vacuum and say, I've got no restraints. There's nothing objectively true. In fact, I'll tell you what's true. Is 2 + 2 = 5? Yeah, if I say so. See, so trouble is if you evacuate the moral and epistemological realm of something like real objective truth, powerful people are going to move tyrannically into that space. And by God, have we seen it over the centuries, including in very recent years. So that's why I'm not going to claim with Sam Harris, oh yeah, the problem is uniquely religious fundamentalism. No. I'm just as worried, if not more worried, about a sort of secularistic fundamentalism, which is this chaotic relativism.
So you point out that we need to find sort of a middle path or a third way between these two extremes. And that's what Peterson tries to do in a lot of these discussions. But what emerges when he's talking about his solution is a Kantian approach. Now, I guess, first of all, tell us a little bit about Immanuel Kant and what's significant, at least in relation to this conversation.
Well, let me do something first, though, Brandon, because what Peterson does is, and he does it very consistently, is he will say the great narratives, let's say of the biblical tradition, which he knows the best, the great narratives of the biblical tradition contain within themselves certain moral forms and principles. And these principles are, and I think he's right about this, are best exemplified in narrative form. So you can state a moral principle abstractly, or you can tell a story that exemplifies it. Which one is better? Everyone agrees the story's better, right? Which is why the Bible has the form that it has. So in the stories of the Garden of Eden and the Tower of Babel and the flood of Noah and the call of Abraham, etc., Cain and Abel, in all these great stories, there are, I call them moral and psychological principles that are so fundamental and so ancient and so archetypal that they remain of extraordinary significance to this day, that we can't really live our moral lives outside of this kind of narrative illumination, this narrative display of the fundamentals of the moral life. That's as I take Jordan Peterson as he reads, and very effectively. I think he reads with penetrating insight a lot of these biblical stories. Now, that approach is kind of Jungian. I've used the word archetypal, and that's a Jungian term, right? The archetypes of the collective unconscious are these great patterns of meaning that are often embedded in the rituals and narratives of the great traditions, come right up to Star Wars. So George Lucas, influenced by Joseph Campbell, who himself was a Jungian like Jordan Peterson. And you see in the Star Wars narrative, right, which, again, beautiful. Every kid in the world knows and loves that narrative. Now, why? Because it embodies certain psychological and moral structures that make our lives possible. So that's, I think, the space that Jordan Peterson likes to explore.
We've done a couple episodes on the podcast in the past about Jordan Peterson and these Jungian archetypes. So if you missed that, if all of these names and terms are a little hazy, go back and listen to those. I think it'll fill in some of the gaps. But what you point out here in this latest commentary is that he seems to admire the moral principles and the moral framework of the Bible, but he seems somewhat ambivalent toward the historicity or the existence of metaphysical things like God or, objective morality. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, right. And that's where I see the Kantian connection. So God, and people have pressed Jordan Peterson again and again on the question, do you believe in God? And I understand his reticence about giving just some, one univocal answer, because people take the term in such a multivalent way. I get that. But what he tends to do is to bracket, as you say, the grand metaphysical questions, cosmological arguments. Is there, in fact, a first metaphysical principle that lies behind the contingency of the world? Is there, in fact, a great intelligent source behind the intelligibility of the world? And, these classical cosmological arguments. He tends not so much to refute them as to set them aside and to move into, I think, a much more Kantian space. Now, here I'm referring to the great Immanuel Kant, as you say, 18th century Prussian philosopher, probably the greatest of the modern philosophers, grounded in people like, Descartes and Spinoza and so on, Hume. But Kant in some ways sums up a lot of the instincts of modern philosophy. Well, what do you find in Kant? But a very similar move. In the Critique of Pure Reason, his first great critique, he effectively brackets the metaphysical questions about God, that pure reason on its own can't attain to this metaphysical realm, because all it can really talk about, Kant says, is the world of phenomena, what appears. Phenomena as they are ordered and received by the a priori notions of the mind. So there's the critique of pure reason. He tends to undo in his mind or unravel the classical arguments because they don't work. However, now move to the second critique, the critique of practical reason, which talks about the moral life. And here Kant uses language that I think is echoed very much in Jordan Peterson, namely that God is a sort of pure idea of the practical reason that makes the moral life possible. Now, I can't go into all the details. Read commentaries on Kant, or if you dare, get the critique of practical reason and go through it. But God is what he calls a regulative idea of the practical reason. Now, take one more step. What some call the fourth critique, as a book called Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. Kant writes at the very end of his career. Religion, he says there, comes down fundamentally to ethics. Religion is basically about ethics. So liturgy and metaphysics and all this business, sacraments, that's all trivial or secondary. What it really comes down to is ethics. Again, that sounds a bit like Peterson, where there's a great interest in the ethical life. But then secondly, Kant says, Jesus is also a kind of regulative idea of this ethical religion. Did Jesus actually exist? I don't know. Does it matter for Kant? Not really. What matters is the role he plays in the grounding narrative of the New Testament, because he is the exemplification of the person perfectly pleasing to God, Kant says, right? The idea of the person perfectly pleasing to God appears in narrative form in the New Testament. And so as I listened to Peterson, I kept thinking, it's the Kantian approach again, tending to bracket metaphysics, focusing on ethics, on morality, and tending to see the archetypal significance of these narrative moves and characters, you know? So in that way, I think he is Jung for our time. He's also very Nietzschean. That could be talked for another day. But I think he's also very much a Kantian figure for our time.
Now, I don't want to psychoanalyze Jordan Peterson in this podcast, and we're hoping, I know a lot of people are going to email us to ask, when are Bishop Barron and Jordan Peterson getting together? We're working on that. We've got some good leads. Hopefully we'll get you guys together here in the next few months. But when you're talking with somebody coming from a Jungian background or a Kantian background, how do you help them take the next step beyond just the archetypal analysis of, say, Jesus, and move to the historical or personal analysis?
Yeah, and that's where you are. I think here's the first move, is to say everything you said is good. I think there really are these great Jungian archetypes embedded in the biblical narratives. I agree with my friend Chris Kazor from LMU, who studied Peterson in this a lot, and said what he does corresponds to the church fathers, what they would have called the moral sense of the scripture. They say there are four senses of scripture, one of them being the moral sense. And we might say today the psychological sense, but that's what Peterson's very good at exemplifying. So I would say, yeah, good, right. I agree, I might then begin to press him, but are there other senses of the Bible? Is there more to it than is going on in those archetypal stories? In a similar way with Kant, does the New Testament, in fact, present the archetype of the person perfectly pleasing to God? Yeah, sure it does. Might we even construe a lot of the moral life in reference to that heuristic regulative idea? Yeah, sure. I'm okay with that. But there's more going on, because I would argue what really matters at the end of the day is that it happened. It really happened. It's not just an idea that's now narratively expressed. It's a real person who, historically speaking, so embodied the archetype that he transformed the whole world. This is not just a narrative projection of a heuristic or regulative idea. If you want, it's a projection of God's mind. The Word became flesh, and that matters, see? And the New Testament and the Bible as a whole is very interested in the historical manifestations and the historical ways that God has communicated himself, as well as being interested in the archetypal and heuristic level. So anyway, that's where I would tease out or try to press Jordan Peterson.
Why do you think for Jungians, for Kantians, that questions of metaphysics are bracketed? Do you think they just find them uninteresting, or are there deeper reasons?
No, I think it's because, and this is the central drama in many ways of modern philosophy, because they felt and I think with a deep frustration in a way, that they couldn't do it, that it's just not available to them. So I think Kant is with a sort of resignation, like, yeah, I kind of wish it, but pure reason just can't reach these things. And I don't think the arguments work. And so, but I'm Kant now. I'm trying desperately to hang on to what's really good and right and beautiful in religion. And this is the way to do it. Another key thing, and this is I'm boring people with these names, but this great figure of Lessing, I always forget his first name. It's either Gotthold or Gottfried or something, but Lessing, Lessing, is one of the most important players in modern thought, because he gave rise to one great idea. Lessing said, there yawns between the universal ideas of reason and the concrete facts of history a great gulf. And it's called Lessing's Gulf now. This great gully, this great gulf in between what the reason wants, which is certitude, absolute truth, and what history can deliver, which is contingent and evanescent facts of history. And you can't get from one to the other, see? So a lot of the moderns, especially in religion, are either weeping over, trying to build bridges over, running away from, hurling themselves into Lessing's Gulf, And see, in a way, Kant is responding there too by saying, finally, look, it doesn't really matter whether there really was a Jesus who did all these things. What matters is, and again, look what he's doing, staying on one side of Lessing's Gulf, the pure ideas of the universal ideas of reason, these regulative ideas of the practical reason. Sure, that's all that matters, and we can bracket history. But see, Christianity can't do that. We have to deal with Lessing's Gulf in a much more creative way than that. So that's another lecture,
Well, that sound means it's time for a question from one of our listeners. If you have a question, we'd love to hear it. Visit askbishopbarron.com. Ask anything about theology, spirituality, morality, philosophy, whatever's on your mind. We'd love to hear it. Today we have a question from Jimmy, who lives in Seattle. However, he's formerly from India, and he's asking about Hinduism and how it compares to Christianity. So here's Jimmy's question.
This is Jimmy from Seattle. I'm Catholic, originally from India. Here is a hypothetical argument my Hindu friends could make. Western Christian civilization hasn't been exemplary. The British took over India. There was slavery and the Holocaust. On the other hand, we've been a tolerant civilization. Given this context, why become Christian? Besides, I'm perfectly happy with my religion and culture. My question is, how does one respond to this line of reasoning?
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. It's going to sound maybe a little bit flip, but the answer is, well, because it's true. In other words, it's not simply a matter of which one has given rise to the best behavior. Let's say every single Christian in the world was a complete jerk. Well, but still Christianity is true, So that's the reason. So you'd have to argue on different grounds there. Now, having said that, is it supposed to make people better? Yes, indeed. Is it a scandal that lots of Christians have behaved in reprehensible ways? Absolutely. And it does indeed undermine evangelization. I get that. Now, I'd also maybe play a little bit on the other side of the question. I'm not entirely convinced that Hinduism has always been a model of toleration and nonviolence. I mean, Gandhi didn't meet with immediate agreement when he spoke to his Hindu fellow believers about nonviolence. In fact, Gandhi learned that from Matthew's Gospel when he was a young law student in London. Talk to people today who are victims of forms of Hindu fundamentalism. So again, just to maybe caution, I don't think it's simply an either or like those terrible Christians and these lovely Hindus. My own Christian convictions lead me to say that human beings are a bad lot. We just tend to go bad. And I'm pretty confident anywhere you look, anywhere in the world, you're going to find a lot of very bad behavior. So in a way, I suppose that balances itself out. That's a more of a secondary question. What finally matters is it true? Is it true? Is God real? Did he send his son? Did he rise from the dead? We'd have to look at those questions, I suppose, first.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. Listen, we mentioned this last week, but tomorrow, Tuesday, February 29th, begins our first ever Word on Fire Institute online summit. This is a virtual event for 3 days where we have expert interviews with people like Bishop Barron, our Word on Fire Institute fellows. The whole theme is evangelizing the unaffiliated. So you're going to want to sign up. Just go to wordonfireshow.com/summit. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.